Shadowverse.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and Veritasium has recently done a video on the katana that I would like to reply to, both to correct some incorrect information in it and to expound a bit further on the topic in some areas which I think could do with a bit more clarification and understanding. Now, this isn't a dig at Veritasium. In fact, it's one of my favorite channels. One of my first channels I've ever subscribed to on YouTube when I even started watching it was Veritasium. So they're an OG creator, makes great content. This is just one of those areas where I feel I can add some good, important information, because this is definitely one of my areas of deep interest. I've been studying the katana, using katana, testing them out, their limits, their strengths, weaknesses, for years. Almost up to 8 years now. And that's in the practical side. I've had interest in swords my whole life, as you can probably tell by the channel here at Shadowversity. Let me start off this video making very clear that the katana is absolutely one of my favorite swords. I love it. What I kind of try and correct is the sensationalization around this sword and the misinformation, because there is deep misinformation about it. And it's unfortunate that some of the most lauded features of the katana are the most misunderstood and never mentioned, okay? And then people kind of latch on to or over-exaggerate other features that are either, yeah, it's praiseworthy, but then it's kind of framed in such a way that it was only the, people of Japan or the katana that had swords made this way, which absolutely wasn't the case. A lot of the technology involved in how the katana was made was absolutely understood in the Middle East, okay, both in certain parts of Asia, so definitely looking at India, and also medieval Europe. And so there is this kind of misunderstanding of the technology, as well as the exaggeration of its features, and then missing some of the really interesting elements that do, complement the sword quite impressively. And I have talked about some of these features in many videos. There's a video where, my favorite things about the katana and stuff like that. And unfortunately, there's just far more misinformation that still gets perpetuated. Now, a lot of the information in Veritasium's video is all right. Okay, it's more stock standard kind of surface layer information about the katana without going super deep, and that can lead to some misinterpretations or even reinforcing other misconceptions about the sword. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the things that I can either add information to or even, if there needs to be, a correction. And it's because the need to correct much misinformation about the katana, and the fact that it gets misrepresented so much gives the impression that I don't like the katana, I'm always ragging on it, when, no, this is genuinely one of my favorite swords. I wouldn't own so many katanas, and this is just a few here because they're going to be pertinent to the video, right, if I didn't like them. I absolutely love this sword, and it's also an annoyance that I love other swords that either don't get enough credit, where they really do deserve a lot of credit for just the genius and incredible nature of how they were made, right? But also how well they perform, and then they get either not enough credit or actively denigrated unfairly and misrepresented, being shown to being poor. And so it always seems like I'm trying to push back against the katana and promote other swords when I'm really just trying to correct the understanding. And that's the purpose of me replying here. And so the most expensive sword in the world, how are they made? Now, the katana, there are some very expensive ones, as there are expensive other swords in the world, but the katana does have this prestige because of this, I would almost call propaganda, okay? Some of the people that are the most active in misrepresenting the katana are actually many Japanese people, because it's a pretty cool badge to be seen as, the culture that is making the best sword in the world. And I have to admit, they promote that a lot. Not just in pop culture, by the way, in even more seemingly academic presentations, documentaries and stuff, the people making them as well, misrepresenting certain key, interesting, important details that, add more context to reveal that this is a very good sword that's very equivalent to many other swords in the world. It's not the best, and it has some distinct weaknesses that need to be acknowledged, but when you understand those weaknesses, okay, it helps you appreciate certain other elements. Some of the best things about the katana is its actual blade profile, but it has this blade profile to overcome one of the weaknesses, but that blade profile gives a really positive result in the way it's used. I've talked about this in my, benefits of the katana. The way the hilt is constructed has a really good positive use as well. The edge profile and taking the full advantage of being single-edged, again, another really big thing. But people always latch onto other odd things about it's because it's made out of folded steel, or it has a curve assisting in cutting, and I've tried to debunk those misconceptions in many videos. Like I have a dedicated video. What benefit do you really get out of having a slight curve? Because this isn't a big curve. It's barely off straight. Anyway, so that's the preamble to lay a foundation as we go into Veritasium's video, and I'm going to be stopping at the points that, as I said, add a bit more clarification or a correction if needed.
This is a video about how Japanese swords are made. Swords that are strong enough and sharp enough to slice a bullet in half.
Right out of the gate, we have a small issue here, because it's implying that the Japanese katana is so good because it can achieve those things, even though it doesn't say it directly, there's the implication that they're so good because they're achieving something exceptional that other swords are unable to achieve. The katana is so great that it can chop a bullet in half, and it must be only so great because it's one of the few or only swords that can do that. Well, no. And also the sword shown in this video, I need to know, is this a traditionally made katana? Okay, or is it made out of modern steel and other elements, right? Other swords can absolutely chop a bullet in half, depending on also how soft the bullet is, the caliber. There's so many elements that come into that statement, okay, where in reality, a traditionally made katana, like if you were to make one exactly how it's period made, and by the way, the sword featured in this Veritasium video are not exactly how period katanas were made. All right, they're actually using a lot of modern shortcuts or cheats, okay, that help overcome some of the weaknesses that would seep into the manufacturing process, the forging process of the katana, that would lead to certain weaknesses. And so when they present these modern katanas, okay, and they say that they are made in the traditional method, they're actually not very good analogs to real traditionally historical made, the traditionally made historical katanas because of those modern shortcuts. And we see some in this video that they say, well, they do it this way, that they use modern air pumps instead of the regular foot, bellows, the way that the Tatara is disassembled, the way that the iron ore was sourced, and all those things are little things that they're doing, modern, conveniences that will ensure a much higher resulting sword, okay, give higher chances of a better quality sword at the end product, where historically they did not have those luxuries, okay? So a traditionally made katana put up to a bullet test most likely would not survive very well, nowhere near to the level I'm showing in this video. So even right out of the gate, we have a pretty significant bit of, and I don't think it's like purposeful misinformation. Actually, Derek, really good guy, Veritasium, they do try their best to present correct information. I think this is just a bit of a slip, okay, when there's still a lot of information that needs to be clarified though, and it's one of those perhaps, mistakes without realizing that it is already structuring or framing the presentation of this video as the katana being better, when the katana is great, but it's actually it's very equivalent to many other swords in history, and in some cases worse, and in other cases better. There's so many elements and nuance to sword construction, design, and performance that it's not a monolith where there is just one sword better than all the others.
The method of making these swords has remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of years.
Okay, which period of 100 years and virtually unchanged? Like there is a lot of traditional preservation that happens in Japan, which I really respect. Preserving tradition, traditional methods, things. In fact, Japan does it a lot better. I wish we did more of that in the West, especially for the medieval period, trying to preserve traditional crafts. I wish, right? But this is implying that the katana, again, the way that it was made was consistent through hundreds of years within the period when the actual period, where it also depends on which period in Japanese history you look at. During, say, the 13th, 14th century and stuff, there was no monolithic universal way of making katana. There was probably ways that were far superior than other methods, but no, there are multiple changes in the process, okay, as well as faster, cheaper ways of making it. Like, the traditional way, especially the folding process, takes a long time. And there's many instances when you need to equip your soldiers with weapons that need to be made more affordably and faster. All right? There are a lot of surviving examples of Japanese swords of very low quality. All right? Not made to nearly the stringent quality kind of standard of the traditional way. And that traditional way isn't necessarily the monolithic main way that all samurai swords would always, be made, even in the times where it was more commonly adopted. And so it's this whole popularization of, because it has artistic merit, and it's especially for the craftsmanship and time that's required to go into it. This one seems to be popularized because it celebrates that craftsman angle in how it's being made. But to say that this was the way it was made for hundreds of years within, medieval Japan, okay, and it was so standardized and all katana were made so well, that is completely incorrect.
The method of making these swords has remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of years, with everything done by hand.
Because it is showing that these are the methods they're using in the modern day with everything done by hand. But they also later in this video show they're using an automatic, hammer to fold and shape the steel, that's not being done by hand. The sword that they're showing being made is not 100% handmade product. Again, one of those more modern, shortcuts that will ensure a higher quality product in the end. It's much harder and takes longer to fold steel, all right, and to shape the sword purely by hand, and to get a really consistent finished result. You'll get a greater chance of having a better quality finished sword using that modern automatic forging hammer.
They are still considered to be among the best in the world.
Among the best in the world. They are considered to be amongst the best in the world. Are they amongst the best? It depends. Not all katana, historically, were made to the quality that they're implying or showing in this video, all right? This is the best of the best, resulting in the best quality, okay? A lot of the standard stock, katana made had a lot of impurities in them, had funky heat treatment and tempering on them, would get damaged quite easily, and they were nowhere near the incredible quality that they are presenting in this video. That's the same with other parts in history, but it seems like when people are representing European swords, that they always represent the mid-tier, and when they represent Japanese swords, they represent the cream of the crop, the very best. If you want to compare best to best, you can do that. I've done that many times on the channel, and the best quality European swords, as well as Middle Eastern swords and stuff like that, were crazy. And in actual fact, their steel quality and performances were better because a lot of them were made out of spring steel. We have direct historical comparisons, surviving examples. Just the way that the katana is traditionally made in this method does not result in a spring steel sword, which means when it bends, it stays bent and it has less resistance to shock. And we have surviving examples of medieval swords that still have the spring temper on them. Adam Savage from Tested, formerly Mythbusters, literally went to a museum and handled one of the Alexandrian Oakshot Type 18C swords. And he shows the spring temper still on those swords. It's amazing, right?
So this one has the diamond cross section, gives a little more rigidity to the thrust. But here's what I love. All right, grab it. See how much flex you have in there. These were remarkably flexible. Yeah. We have some where if you hold it out straight, it'll actually bow a little bit on its own weight. Yeah. So this would have still been a nasty cutter, despite being, having the diamond cross. Oh yeah, it feels fabulous, right?
Oh,
originally.
Man, this is. You're right. I mean, the balance of this is...
You could easily, you have two hands, but you could easily wield that with one hand very comfortably. It bounces quite close to the grip. I think the size of the pommel, the width of the blade right at the base there, and the guard really keeps sort of the mass very close to the hand. Great feel.
What's the total weight of this?
So that is 3 pounds, 10 ounces.
Okay.
Which is not a lot, really.
No, not. And again, the pommel makes it feel much lighter because of the counterweight.
And so, if you're going to just like go, okay, you want to compare best to the best, spring steel is incredible. There are examples in multiple points of European history that shows they had spring steel. I mean, they were making crossbow limbs out of spring steel on the regular. So yes, they definitely had them. And in testing spring steel versus more traditionally made, both of these katanas, by the way, this one is valued at 1,500 US, 1,000 US. This one has folded steel in it, and this one has when I say it's not laid in folding, but it has a different grade of steel as the core and different grade of steel on the edge. And these swords, even with the traditional aspects a part of them, right? They still are made out of more high quality modern steel in traditional ways. And comparing these, so it's really comparing craftsmanship method now, not steel grade quality, compared to other ones, they perform far, far worse than spring steel swords made out of similar grades of steel. Then we can extrapolate that to be similar results to European swords that were made out of the same different kind of methods, but then both being on the same grade of steel.
So now we head into the final test, and both swords are still holding their own. This is the wood test, where basically we hit the swords really, really hard on a piece of wood, as hard as possible. Now this is a standard test that we use to review many swords, but how will the $1,000 katana fare? Let's find out.
Gosh, look at the chunk. I was saying, it's not determining how much damage to do to the wood. Yeah, we're doing a lot of damage to the wood.
That's a lot of damage.
I want to show. Let's see.
It's fine.
It is. It is completely fine. No discernible edge damage. Not even the slightest discernible thing on the edge.
I'm going to be honest, this keeps happening.
We need a better brace for that.
But we have some news. Mm-hmm. Have a look.
Not only, it bends one way and then bends back the other way.
Interestingly enough, after the final test, the $1,000 differentially hardened folded steel katana ended up becoming bent, while the longsword is still completely fine.
And we see other examples of that in other cultures. This is not an uncommon or mysterious or secret method that only the Japanese had, okay? And by the way, those European swords that were made in those different layered methods with different core grades of steel would have the exact same problems that the Japanese katanas, which are made that way. You want mono steel, homogeneous, mono, good quality steel, high carbon, that you then temper into martensite, and then, you quench into martensite, and then you temper into a spring to get spring steel. And then with spring steel, you are operating on a whole different level. And we have tested this multiple times here on the channel about the advantages of spring steel. And it wasn't to favor spring steel. It's like we have a spring steel sword and a sword that's made with differential hardening. Let's see which one performs better. And the spring steel ones operate on a vastly higher level. And so in that sense, Japanese katanas made in this method are actually not amongst the best swords in the world. They're amongst the good quality, they're still good quality, very well made, swords in the same level as other swords in the world. But in terms of how well they perform under use, there are some significant problems. There are great benefits in other areas. Like I said, blade profile, the way the hilt is constructed, that is more special to the katana, you could say. Not unique, because it's found in other swords as well, but it's just that comparison again.
The Japanese made a weapon that was the absolute pinnacle for their style of warfare and the materials they had at hand.
That is a very carefully constructed comment right there. So props to the individual who said it, because to say that the katana is the pinnacle...
The absolute pinnacle for their style of...
Absolutely, because to say the katana is the absolute pinnacle sword ever made is complete nonsense, but the caveats for their style of warfare, that one's debatable, but then this comment.
Warfare and the materials they had at hand.
And the materials they had at hand. Okay. That's the important caveat that I think a lot of people probably miss, actually. For the materials they had at hand, the katana is a very good sword for the materials they had at hand. They could actually have made a better sword with the materials they had at hand if they understood superior smelting technology and forging techniques to result in spring steel. A lot of modern katanas, okay, that are made for pure performance, and they're not after the artistic aspect. By the way, there is value in that artistic aspect. That's why I own certain traditionally made katanas, because it is beautiful. But if you want performance, okay, this $170 katana, this is sold by Romance of Men, and they sent it to us review, and we have punished it. Look at the edge damage on this if you can see it, right? We have smashed this against armor and everything, and it is held up remarkably well. Why? It's made out of modern spring steel, okay? This $150 to $70 sword is a superior sword in terms of performance and steel quality than the $1,000 katana right here. Oh, and if you're interested in a functional, sharp, decent quality, but very affordable katana, we do have an affiliate link for the Romance of Men katana in the description below. And this is why most katana that are sold for performance, okay, are made with modern day spring steel. Just spring steel, all right? And if Japan actually either were aware or knew how to make or could see the performance in action, okay, about how a katana would actually perform if it was made out of spring steel, I think they would have opted for that. There's a reason why Japan would import certain Western, items, because of their quality. One of the things they imported a lot was actually armor, and so you see certain Japanese suits of armor that have European breastplates on them because it was made out of vastly superior steel, and they perform better. But I think tradition also played a part in the methodology they adopted and didn't want to change from in terms of the way that the katana is made. And it isn't necessarily because it's actually better, but it is artistically beautiful, and I think that has cultural, influence as to why they latched onto this method, and it's become the most popular. And so the statement that it was, the pinnacle sword that they could make for the material, and meaning also I think technology they had available, I disagree with, but at least he has that caveat that because there are material limitations, and the whole reason why the katana needs to be folded is because of the impurities in the steel. We'll get to that.
These swords are held in such high regard that one from the 16th century has been appraised at $105 million. It's
a very expensive sword. That looks like a tachi, not a katana, technically. You can tell by a tachi is that it usually has a more predominant curve on it, the fitting on the end as well. And also just overall length, it looks a bit longer than a standard katana. So yeah, I would say that's a tachi. But things are worth what people are willing to pay for them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that this katana, in terms of historical value, materials made, the impressiveness of what it represents for the technology time period, I would actually value one of the Alexandrian swords, that spring steel one that Adam Savage showed the Tempest still on. Personally, I would value that much, much more. If I had to, what sword would I be willing to pay more for? It would be definitely that one. Not to say I wouldn't pay a lot for a really awesome, historical katana if I had the money available.
Making it the most expensive sword ever built.
Most expensive sword ever built. That one is also laced with, it didn't cost more materials to make in period than a lot of other swords. Technically, it is the most expensive one ever built in current value, but it doesn't make it more special for what it actually is and how it was made.
In the Shimane province of Japan, there is a smelter that is lit for only one night each year, where steel is made in the same way it was.
Only lit one night each year. To me, the reason why they would do that is that creates a scarcity of the type of steel that they're producing here, which would then inflate the price, and people will pay through the nose for traditionally made tamahagane to make the swords. So if you're wondering why, traditionally made katana made out of traditionally smelted tamahagane are so expensive, they're being so restrictive in how much tamahagane is in the market, that might have an effect.
It's made in the same way it was 1,300 years ago.
That's not actually the case. Some of the core methods, but they're using modern-day fans instead of foot, bellows. And it's not a traditional Tatara that needs to be broken apart, all right, made out of clay, which could affect how much heat gets trapped in the furnace. And the iron ore that they're using probably was sifted with magnets to separate the iron ore sand from other impurities. These are all things that are, not mentioned in the documentary, but also when the people who are, making the katana, or the metal in this case, never really mentioned. Like, again, the fact that they're using iron ore sand that was most likely sourced through modern methods is never mentioned, okay? And they praise the tamahagane that is made out of these modern-day smelters as being very pure. This tamahagane is pure.
I have a piece of bloomery, or tamahagane from Japan, and this particular piece contains virtually no slag, so it is fairly clean.
And oftentimes, they are saying it with the direct implication that tamahagane is therefore very pure, high-quality, high-carbon steel, reflecting that the traditional period tamahagane was of similar quality, when no, it was not. Tamahagane was pure, high-quality steel right out of the furnace. You wouldn't need to fold it to remove those impurities. Veritasium does say that there are impurities in, and there are a couple of good acknowledgements that don't usually get mentioned, so I'm grateful for that. But it's kind of statements like this that it's like, and it's the omission of certain facts that also imply other things. Now, again, they don't say that tamahagane is necessarily pure here. He does mention that the iron ore sand is pure. We'll get to that. But there are other documentaries and people who promote, katana that are making them usually say tamahagane is particularly pure, when it's because it was made with modern methods in the process. This is not a 100% traditional way of making smelting tamahagane and resulting in the iron ore bloom that they have. And by the way, the method that they're doing here is bloomery smelting. This is very common, known throughout many cultures throughout history. That's one of the first ways we smelted iron, was with a bloomery furnace. The Tatara is just a very big bloomery furnace. That's about the main primary difference. And it has all the same limitations that bloomery smelting has, that other cultures face. And Veritasium mentions what some of those are in the video, like it doesn't fully liquefy the iron. There are other implications that he doesn't mention that results in. And it does, so when the Tatara is presented, it is often presented as this particularly special, highly advanced, refined way of producing high-carbon steel, when it was actually a very common way. It's not that special.
It's known as the Tatara method, and only steel made in this way ends up in the very best Japanese swords.
Only steel made in this way results in the very best Japanese swords. That's because of a artificial enforcement in the market, where, and it depends what you mean by best Japanese swords. Like, if people now believe that only the best Japanese swords have tamahagane that are made in these, traditional yet modern enhanced methods, and they restricted to that, then the resulting will be that. If they forged the katana out of high quality steel and did the same etching, everything like that, it doesn't have the artistic aspect in it, so I guess, but that's what they would mean by best. But best can also imply highest performance swords. And swords made out of steel that was made this way, all right, in these traditional methods will not result in the highest performance swords. In actual fact, because they're made in these traditional methods, it will result in a sword that will bend much easier than normal. Take a set easier and keep that set, and will chip. It has a pretty fragile. It can have a fragile edge. Hard, all right, robust in a sense, but when it comes up against other really hard materials, it can chip. Okay, depending on the hardness. And so again, it's these kind of unspoken implications when they say, you know, the best quality katana are only made out of this way. What do you mean by best? Okay, best in an artistic sense, I could probably grant that. Best in a performance sense? No, these swords would not be the best in performance. This sword right here, it's a, like I said, $170 spring steel katana will perform better than the ones being showcased in the video that are made with this Tamahagane steel. By orders of magnitude, by the way. Like, the performance of some of these traditional katana, right, can be pretty poor when put up against serious abuse, but they're works of art. People don't really put them up against proper abuse. We do here on Shadiversity. We tried to chop down trees with some of these swords, just to see how much, you know, punishment they can take. So in the Veritasium video, Derek kind of goes through a process of primary ways iron, you know, came about on Earth, and other areas where it's most predominantly found, and the limitations in Japan of the fact that the more common ways of mining iron aren't around, and it results, one of the ways they source iron ore was in iron ore sand, and then he mentions in rivers, and he says this.
And washed downstream. Eventually, they become part of the sand. The Japanese noticed that because iron oxides are denser than other minerals in the sand, they accumulate in places where the river changes direction or speed.
So then Veritasium goes on to explain that they collected iron ores a lot from the rivers. Doesn't really mention that one of the other places where a lot of this iron ore sand gets deposited on is on beaches. This can be a bit misleading because there is an interesting benefit that you get when you mine or collect iron ore sand along rivers, where there can be this type of sifting process which results in sometimes, you know, more pure iron ore. When I say pure, there's still a lot of impurities in it, okay? And then there's the fact that if you collect it on beaches, you don't have that sifting method, and then there are a lot of impurities. And so the implication is that, because he doesn't mention other areas in which this iron ore was sourced, that there's an implication that most iron ore sourced in Japan just is of a higher, more pure state than other areas in which... No, that actually isn't the case. There are instances where this iron ore sand, setetsu in Japanese, but that is black iron oxide, okay? Or also known as magnetite. That's the iron ore sand that we're talking about here. It's nothing special. It's not like this unique iron ore sand that is only found in Japan. It's iron ore that can make, you know, functional good swords depending on your smelting technology and other ways in which it's collected.
They deliberately created diversions in the river to increase the concentration of iron.
What you do is you dam off a section of river and then you drag sand in.
That's more concentrated than high-quality iron ore.
The issue here is that, yes, you can get iron ore to this level of purity using this method, but that's not guaranteed. There are many instances of people collecting iron ore this way which still have a higher percentage of impurities than the most optimal outcomes which you can achieve, but the main question is how common that is. Is it a regular? Is it a standard? When more commonly iron ore collected this way, even though it can result in more pure iron ore, not all the time, nor was this the only way in which iron ore sand was collected. Not all iron ore sourced in Japan was of that quality, and it also has many impurities in it. Like, if you just to smelt that iron ore as is and not try to remove impurities, you're going to result in some pretty crappy steel. You definitely need a method to get rid of them all, and the smelting method that the Japanese did with the Tatara, more specifically, does not get rid of nearly all of those impurities. I don't know, like, not a lot gets trapped in the iron ore itself.
And since it has fewer impurities, it's an excellent source material for high-quality steel.
Excellent source for high quality. Yeah, that's correct. But it's not the only source, that's the issue.
If you heat up the...
Sorry, not the only common source in Japan.
So with the iron sand, it is mixed together with water because if you...
All right, so this iron sand here is either going to be one of two states. It was either collected in a very traditional way, all right, which means there's going to be a lot of impurities in it, all right, or it was had some refining or sifting done. And one of the real easy methods with iron ore sand to just try to pull out the iron and leave a lot of the other silicates and junk is with magnets. Okay, you could do it with simple magnets in a plastic bag where you put the iron and then you pull it out of it and it just falls down. Electromagnets is done as well. And I highly suspect this iron ore sand has been sifted in some measure, okay? Usually methods that were nowhere near available. Well, you know, yes, they could find magnets, but it wasn't a regular thing done in medieval Japan, okay? And even then, there are a lot of other issues with iron ore that you need to deal with. Sulfur and phosphorus are two big issues that it doesn't seem the Japanese did. And so what you notice here with the iron ore, they don't mention it, but I've heard no indication of them pre-baking the iron ore. And so one of the ways that you get rid of sulfur is pre-baking the iron ore. And there are other cultures where in their smelting kind of areas where, like, all right, there's a big smelter here, we find what are called baking pits, these round holes in the ground where they would just chuck the iron in a big fire and just pre-bake it, okay? That gets rid of all moisture as well, which is helpful, but it also burns off sulfur, and that helps prep the iron to result in much higher quality at the end. Now, Veritasium, they do mention that one of the issues of the steel that comes out of the Tatara is that it has sulfur still in because they don't pre-bake it, okay? And then if it hasn't been sifted, with either magnets or even you can even kind of pan, gold pan way to brush off lighter material. You're not going to get rid of everything by doing that, and it's a very lengthy process. It's going to have a lot of impurities in it. But again, if they're claiming that the tamahagane is nearly pure, as it comes out of the Tatara, the only way that results is if they sifted the iron ore before it goes in, okay? Because the Tatara's bloomery furnace, it does not fully liquefy the iron, and therefore the non-metallic inclusions do not diffuse out of, they get trapped in that kind of it's a mass. It's not fully liquid, but it's this kind of somewhat spongy, partially liquid, almost like molasses or honey, right? It gets to kind of that consistency, right? But that's not enough for the non-metallic inclusions to just rise to the surface. It's only when you fully liquefy it, right? Then those rise to the surface. A lot of the surface imperfections that are not already kind of ingrained and diffused into the iron will drip to the bottom, which Veritasium mentions, but a lot of it gets trapped in the steel itself.
To achieve the high temperatures required to make steel, you need a strong, steady supply of oxygen. For hundreds of years, this was provided by huge foot-operated bellows. It would have taken an around-the-clock, full-body effort by...
This part is really important because the temperature of the furnace is crucial in the quality of steel at the end. More of the slag, especially surface slag that's not necessarily ingrained but part of it, right, has higher chances of being melted away and can drip out if you get higher temperatures. And the higher temperature that you can get the iron ore, the higher chances that the inclusions that are diffused in it can actually either rise to the surface because there's liquefaction and other things. So this is really important. The higher temperature, the better. When you're trying to blow those bellows manually by foot or hand, all right, people get tired and they might lag, and the temperature then in the furnace will lower. And guarantee that was a common issue that they faced historically with any type of, bloomery furnace. And as a result, many steel, much type of steel, much of the tamahagane that comes out, can result in having far greater inclusions and being, less pure steel, right? As a result, and many katana would still have been made out. It's still usable, it's steel, right? And many katana were made out of that, resulting in far less quality katana historically, okay? And so by using a modern method, which is they use, here, right? Which modern, blowers, right? Automatic blowers, they guarantee a higher temperature than what they would be able to maintain manually more often. And they might even be able to reach a higher temperature than they could just manually, especially if they're pumping huge amounts of air in that. They might be able to get the temperature so high that results in, again, much higher quality tamahagane from this method using modern technology, right, than what it was historically. But so often, the steel that comes out of this process, they hold up the tamahagane, they represent as being equivalent to the historical tamahagane. And they say tamahagane is great quality pure steel. When this is night and day. This is nowhere close, okay, to what much traditional tamahagane would have been like. And so it's this misrepresentation, right, that happens a lot. And this isn't, as a result, this is not 100% traditional method of making it. They're using modern cheats and shortcuts to ensure higher quality, and then oftentimes that higher quality is represented as being the quality of the historical sword, which is just flat out incorrect.
It's proper workout of stepping on these bellows for 24 hours.
The temperature inside the smelter gets up to 1500 degrees Celsius.
With consistent air from modern blowers, all right? Foot pumps, people getting tired, lagging, and imperfect flow of air, especially if the Tatara is made out of clay, by the way, which can sometimes crumble and fall in front of the airflow, restricting that airflow as well. In a purely traditional way, maintaining that temperature consistently is so hard, okay? That temperature is mentioning here is only achieved because they're using a modern type of Tatara and modern pumps, air. But even then, even with this, the iron ore does not fully liquefy, as they mention.
Just below the melting point of iron, which is 1538 Celsius. So the iron being smelted isn't liquid, but it's soft and malleable enough to clump together into a big block of iron.
But what is not mentioned here, which I believe is a significant oversight, is that because it doesn't fully liquefy, much of the non-metallic inclusions, the slag, gets trapped in that, semi-liquid mass of iron that is now clumping together. There is a decent amount of slag that does liquefy, but not the stuff that is trapped in the iron itself. It's all the surface stuff around, okay? And then that becomes liquid and then sinks to the bottom and they can drain it out.
No matter how high quality the iron sand is, there will always be some impurities, like sulfur, phosphorus, and silicon oxide.
Now, see what he said here, implying that the iron ore sand that they're using is really good high quality, when that's more, well, it's not a universal case with all iron ore sand sourced historically in Japan. A lot of it could have been very impure, oftentimes was, and we find that, by the way, people have studied historical historical Japanese swords and found, the historical ones have many non-metallic inclusions inside still, all right? We're not dealing with greatly pure iron ore. It was very impure stuff. But is implying that even, it was already good to begin with, but you still have to deal with sulfur, phosphor, and silicon oxides. Most likely, if it was traditionally sourced, they were dealing with a lot of other inclusions as well, not just these ones.
Oxides. They combine with carbon from the charcoal and melt at a lower temperature than iron, so they become liquid and flow to the bottom.
But not the stuff that's trapped in the iron itself.
This is known as slag. After many more hours of adding charcoal and iron sand, it is time for the first removal of the slag. Before the first removal of slag, another prayer is said.
This removal of slag right here, again, common thing with bloomery furnaces.
At this point, in a traditional smelter, the only way to get the steel out would be to break it apart.
Again, because traditionally it would have been like clay, a clay Tatara, which can cause massive problems about heat retention as well as restriction of airflow if it crumbles apart and everything like that. So the fact that you're using kind of what looks to be a lot of modern day either stone or concrete, right, is a modern day cheat, and it shouldn't be considered actually representative of, the type of steel that medieval Japan would have been able to make with this method.
And what is left to show for all that hard work is a 100 kilogram block of steel, iron, and slag. Only around a third of this block is high enough quality to be used in sword making.
A lump of steel, iron, and slag. notice iron. The reason why it's iron is that it's a very imperfect method of steel smelting, okay? There is a whole heap of iron ore that didn't even get diffused with carbon, okay? And steel, iron, and slag. A lot of slag still remaining in it. A lot of slag still in the actual steel itself, okay? And so it's interesting, the Tatara method, in the sense that it's a really big bloomery furnace, because this, in a bloomery furnace that's smaller, your result is called a bloom, and it gets mashed together, and then folding is necessary, which kind of homogenizes it can homogenize the different grades of steel, because it always results in different grades of steel. It didn't liquefy, and then it can also push out a lot of non-metallic inclusions. Talk about that a little as well. By making a much bigger one, instead of just mashing it all together and then homogenizing it, they're able to pick out clumps of higher carbon steel versus the lower carbon steel. And that's set aside, and that is the tamahagane. This whole thing is not tamahagane, okay? A lot of it is just going to be iron, mild steel, mild carbon steel, so low carbon steel, medium carbon steel, and then you have the high carbon steel, and then you also have some like really high carbon steel, pig iron and things, which is actually the tamahagane, by the way, the really high carbon stuff. And in its state as is, the carbon is too high to make a good functional blade. The folding process actually decarburizes a bit to make it fall in the more functional range of high carbon steel, but left by itself, it's not the best. But it is also the direct point of irrefutable proof that this is a very imperfect way of steel smelting. Doesn't even liquefy at all. It is this kind of mess with different grades of steel all over the place. And by the way, right, I've mentioned multiple cultures did this. This was a very common way of steel smelting in medieval Europe for a good while, all right? And it has all the imperfections there. And if anyone from medieval Europe or the Middle East or Asia or India, anywhere, right, was trying to inflate its brilliance in the quality of steel it was making, I would correct that just as much. But it seems like the Tatara and this method of making, steel just gets inflated way beyond the realms of what its real actual quality is. And that's why it always seems like I'm bashing the katana or the traditional way katana is made. No, it's because of the misinformation. In terms of being able to make steel that can, through processes, result in really good quality swords or tools or whatever, it's a very useful way of producing steel. Nothing against that. People have used it all across the world, all right? I'm not dunking on it in that sense. I'm pushing it back against its inflated status of being something particularly special when it's not.
The steel is sorted by quality and carbon content, which is also done by eye.
And most of that steel, right, is just going to be used to make tools, whatever else they need to make out of steel. And the high carbon stuff, of course, because there's less of it, they're reserving that for not only the katana, right, but the edge of the katana, okay? The core, and even sometimes the sides of a katana is made out of the medium carbon and even low carbon stuff. And because most of it's low carbon, well, they use low carbon, sometimes just near iron as the core of the katana, which isn't necessarily a good thing. People usually latch onto that as some ingenious method to make a superior sword. No, not necessarily. No, it doesn't result. Like, if you could have a core out of a better quality steel, because you can have steel, right, that cool it differently. You can have differential hardening and everything that can still be a bit softer, but not as bad as iron, right? One of the reasons why they use such low quality steel, low carbon steel, is the core and stuff. More likely was because that's all they had. They had so little high carbon steel that they only had enough to make it on the edge, all right? You will get the result of a much higher quality sword by making the whole thing high carbon, all right, and then tempering it into a spring and make it a spring steel katana. That is just a superior, stronger, more durable sword. Why didn't they do that? one of the more likely reasons is they didn't have enough of it, enough of the high carbon, because only so little of that bloom that comes out of the Tatara was actually high carbon. So if they want to make the highest amount of swords, which all have really high carbon edges, well, they are kind of minimalizing the amount needed of that high carbon steel for the most amount of swords possible, and then just using the rest of the crap to make up the rest. It's not because it results in a higher quality sword. It's more about utilizing the resources that you get out of this imperfect way of making steel and the limited amount of steel that they have to begin with, right? In the most efficient, optimal way possible, in the sense of making the most amount of good quality swords. And so economically, there's some real this is a very smart way of utilizing a very limited resource to produce the highest amounts of high carbon edged blades possible, okay? But it's not because it makes a better sword. So there are things to be praised about the ingenious nature, the clever nature of doing this, but it's not because it was superior for the actual function and utility and durability of the sword itself.
This is when the forging of the sword begins. Then, using hammers, the master swordsmith flattens out the steel. These days, electric hammers are used.
Okay, I don't think this point should just be said and then brushed aside, because this has significant implications on the final quality as well. Using an electric hammer, an automatic hammer, right, hits faster and stronger. This process of folding the steel is a crucial part in terms of the final quality of the sword. When you heat up the billet of steel in the furnace, it's not liquefying, but some of those non-metallic inclusions in the steel will liquefy. Its melting temperature is much lower. And so what you end up when it's like white hot like this is that a bit of steel with a lot of tiny like bubbles of liquefied slag in it. And so what would happen then when you hit that billet really hard with something really solid to those liquefied elements in? It's possible to squeeze them out of the steel, okay? You're not going to squeeze out everything, but some of the larger inclusions, all right? And then if you can kind of thin them out and push them to the side, and you do that by folding, okay, and then it squishes it down even further. Fold it, squishes it down. And so with each fold, these little pockets of liquefied slag are getting squished flatter, 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 and they're not going to be going in, okay? The process of hammering down pushes things outways, right? When you do that. And then when you fold it, with each hammer down, these liquefied bits of slag are getting pushed bit by bit to the edges. And with enough folding, you can force out some of those bits of liquid pockets of slag. That's how it can help purify the steel. It cannot remove all the impurities by doing it. I mean, I wonder if you folded it like enough. We're talking hundreds, thousands of times. Could you squeeze out all those impurities? Possibly. I think it might be possible, but you would also render out all the carbon in the steel as well. This folding process, okay, heating it up and exposing it to air, okay, that air, all right, will latch onto the carbon. And you know that, like scale, that's the surface layer of the iron oxidizing, rusting essentially, but it's a different type. But it also can pull out, like sparks flying off and everything like that. You can render down a high carbon bit of steel through forging into iron if you do it enough. Now, it's useful that they start with very high, basically pig iron, okay? And pig iron is iron with such a high content of carbon in it that's above the grade of steel. But then some of this forging actually pushes it back down into the usable steel area. All right, so using an automatic hammer that can hit faster and harder, it's going to assist pushing out those non-metallic inclusions vastly more than just doing it by hand. You can only hit something so hard. An automatic hammer can hit it much, much faster. You can also fold the steel at a faster rate. Flatten it down, fold it out, because the longer you take in the actual process of folding, all right, there's a chance that you might accidentally let some scale slide in or other inclusions get caught in the fold, okay? So if you can do it faster with an automatic hammer, higher chances of not making mistakes, basically. And so using this automatic hammer, right, will result in a quality of steel for the sword that just by this process is already much, much, much higher chance of being vastly superior to one done by actual hand. And then presenting this sword as a 100% traditionally made sword made by hand is dishonest and it's false. That's not what the period katana would have been like if they were limited with the actual technology, solely by hand, not using automatic hammers, using foot pumps to pump the air into the Tatara, and using a clay Tatara, and using iron or sand that was sourced in a traditional way that wasn't sifted through magnets or anything like that to separate, that still had a lot of those non-metallic inclusions. The chances of producing a much lower quality sword compared to what they're making here is vastly more. The sword quality that would have been made in the actual traditional way would have been far less than what they're making with these modern shortcuts. These modern cheats, essentially.
Folding does two very important things.
So Veritasium mentions two of the advantages. It's odd that he doesn't mention the purifying part, because the purifying part has usually been one of the most commonly ascribed benefits of the folding process. The problem is people usually go too far and say it purifies the steel, resulting in a perfectly pure bit of steel. No, it just helps purify. It gets rid of some of those worst inclusions. Can't get rid of them all, but it does help, okay? It's odd that he doesn't even mention that, but it's good that he does mention that it homogenizes those impurities.
First, it spreads out the impurities, like silicon, sulfur, and phosphorus. It spreads them out throughout the steel. This ensures a uniform consistency without any weak points. Second, it gives the steel a grain. After folding the sword, it is now reinforced in the direction that it will be hit.
Okay, so there is a direction of, it creates a pattern, okay, and then those lines can be ascribed as a grain. The reason why this is problematic is that on a smaller level, on a microscopic level, there is also a grain in the steel. This grain forms when the steel moves from certain phases from being heated up and cooled down. And so when the steel gets heated up to a certain level, it adopts the austenite phase, which is literally the way the atoms kind of are arranged. And when it gets cooled down, the way those atoms then, I guess, rest into creates a crystal structure or a grain, and you can actually, like, you see it, there's visual representation that shows how these crystals, like, they grow out in like pockets, and then when those crystals in growing in pockets, and this is how the atoms are settling, right? When those crystal structures touch, it creates a grain in between those crystal structures.
If we look closely at the surface of the zinc, we see it's built up of many different patches. The patches you see are crystals or grains of zinc. Here's a piece of a different metal. It's been machined along one edge. You can't see any grains in this surface. However, if we turn it over, it's quite a different story. This piece of metal has been broken in half. Along the broken edge, you can see some of the grains from which this material is made. At a number of points in the liquid metal, tiny crystals begin to form and grow. Each crystal grows outwards in all directions until it meets the surfaces of its neighboring crystals. In engineering terms, each fully grown crystal is called a grain.
All right. That grain gets reset every time you heat up the steel into the austenite phase. And any type of grain structure that you force into a blade through forging gets taken out when you heat it up to that stage.
As the metal is squashed between the rollers, it's being cold worked. Let's find out what effect the cold working has on the grain structure of the aluminium. The cold rolled piece of metal is the one at the top. Can you see the difference? We seem to have changed the shape of the grains. They've become elongated. Let's see what effect heating has on the distorted grain structure. In the case of this particular metal, nothing happens until the temperature reaches about 350 degrees centigrade. Now, at the grain boundaries, new grains begin to form. These grow rapidly until a new, undistorted grain structure completely replaces the old, distorted one. We call this process recrystallization.
And so there is a phase in the smithing process that they call normalizing, where they will heat up a the shape of the blade, right, and let it cool down naturally, then heat it up and cool it down naturally, and then normalizing the steel to reset the grain structure, because sometimes the grain structure that gets put into steel when you're hammering it down, like you're compressing those grain structures when you're hammering it down, can be detrimental. And it's far better, and also can cause warps on the quench. And so it's far better to let the grain structure adopt its natural state, depending on the speed in which you quench it then. And then you can manipulate the grain structure. Now, sometimes you can strengthen steel by compressing grain structure. That's not what's happening here, because they're going to reset it when they heat it up again. There is the fact that certain different layers of oxidization gets trapped in the lines, that creates a pattern or a grain in that sense, and that's literally what Derek Veritasium says here. But it seems like he's implying the grain structure that appears through the layering strengthens the steel.
It gives the steel a grain. After folding the sword, it is now reinforced in the direction that it will be hit in combat.
When it doesn't, and not when it's heated up to the austenite phase, which literally is what they're doing in the quench. That's specifically made to reset the grain structure on the microscopic level.
They use steel with different carbon contents for different parts of the blade. The edge is always high carbon steel to make it hard and rigid so it can maintain a sharp edge for a long time. But the spine is usually made of lower carbon steel, which allows the sword to flex without breaking.
Allows the sword to flex without breaking. That's a very charitable way of saying that it means the sword will stay bent when it bends, because it's a low carbon steel, especially even if you quench it right and try and temper it, it's not going to adopt martensite that is then tempered to have, a spring quality. And the notion that having the softer core results in a superior sword is false. Okay, it's mainly due to limited resources of the higher carbon steel. And look, there is one possible benefit out of it, okay? Because they do make the edge harder, okay, in terms of the carbon content and the quenching rate, and it gets tempered to a lesser extent to release some of that tension in the martensite structure, that the edge can be a bit more brittle. And if you had an entire sword, to that level of hardness through hardened, very high chance of it just snapping in two. And so the way that you can prevent it from snapping in two by having a much higher, harder, but also fragile edge is having that soft core. And then what Derek says is accurate, that as a result, it won't snap in two when it bends. He says flexes, but it's not going to flex back. It'll stay bent. And the utility of having a really hard edge like this is a bit of give and take. It's not universally better, okay? We've tested super hard edges against hard things, right? And the result was the super hard edges were brittle. Yeah, that's the result. When it comes up to something too hard, big chips in the blade. Having a blade that instead of chipping gets just a bit of an indent or a small little crack, kind of like the damage that you see on this sword here, if you see that damage, that is vastly more preferable than a big chip. And so it holds its edge really long. It's still considered a high carbon hard edge, just not as high as certain traditional katanas. And as a result, it's more durable and less brittle. And that is preferable. That type of damage on a sword is repairable. Having a big chunk chip out off your blade edge is basically a ruined sword. And it is also a crucial weak point for the rest of the sword to break through as well. But it does mean it'll hold its edge longer, okay, in terms of just general bluntness, and it varies because there are different materials in which it will perform well against. And so soft to medium materials, it does really well with. So that actually includes bone, but also wood. We have found really hard edges keep their edge retention pretty darn good against wood and stuff like that. And so for general kind of hardness of materials, a really hard edge like the katana has significant results and benefits, but then there's the brittleness part. And usually the just a lower bit of hardness, and it's not by much, is still very hard, retains its edge very long, and is more durable, is a much preferable sword construction, honestly. So there is that give and take, though, which I'll happily acknowledge, that it keeps its edge longer and can retain that edge and be more, somewhat effective, a little bit, but still more effective against denser materials, but not actual, like as soon as you come against metal, all right, with a katana, and if it's got that super hardened edge, chips, expect big chips, and the soft backing then will prevent it from snapping in two. That's one of the benefits you get out of it. It doesn't warrant it, in my opinion. I still feel you get a much superior sword with a mono-hardened, through-tempered sword. And this idea that it was always a soft core was because it produced a superior sword is false. It's actually more of an economic benefit, still very smart, because it means they can make more swords out of the limited high carbon steel they have than not. Veritasium just mentioned the differential hardening process, the Clayer layering, and to result in getting the edge hardened stronger. And then this is what he says about the state of the steel in different areas. And so talking about, I think not necessarily the edge here, but the back.
Enters the iron lattice, and since the spine of the sword is covered in thick clay, it will cool slowly, giving time for the carbon atoms to leave the iron matrix. This will lead to a very low carbon steel called ferrite, but the carbon atoms which have left the matrix will be caught by other iron atoms and create a type of steel known as cementite. The combination of ferrite and cementite is known as pearlite, and it's a mostly soft and ductile form of steel.
Okay. There's a lot. There's some problems with what was just said here. Okay, pearlite is covers a range of carbon content in steel, and the edge and back of a katana. It'd be much more accurate just to call it low carbon steel, mild steel, sometimes just ferrite, than pearlite. Because calling it pearlite steel implies that it is steel with the pearlite structure throughout, which is not the case. That is simply inaccurate. For steel to have mostly pearlite structure within it, it needs to be high carbon steel. We're talking about 0.08%. Sorry, I meant to say 0.8% carbon. Carbon, which is in the high carbon steel range. This is low carbon steel on the core and usually back of the katana, okay? And there is pearlite in it, but it's actually ferrite pearlite steel. Again, but by just calling it pearlite, you're implying that the whole thing has pearlite structures. When you look at it under the microscope, you will see large pockets of just ferrite and then pockets of pearlite. And pearlite is that combination of the grain between the cementite and the ferrite, okay? So you have the lines of the cementite and ferrite, but then they form pockets, and then you just have plain ferrite. And that's ferrite pearlite structure, which is what the back of the katana actually is, and that is more ductile and soft. Pure pearlite steel is high carbon and hard and strong, and so saying pearlite steel is a soft grade of steel is just it's incorrect. Like pearlite, the amount or range of steel, okay, that has pearlite structures in, again, goes from like really low all the way up to like 0.8% or something. And here is a graph showing the range of pearlite there. And again, really low carbon all the way up to higher carbon.
So pearlite forms the spine of the sword.
Again, saying it's just pure pearlite on the spine, no, it's actually probably a lower percentage of pearlite structures in that steel versus ferrite structures in this steel because it's low carbon, okay? It'll be more ferrite than pearlite, ferrite pearlite structure. Calling it just pearlite is incorrect because pearlite in and of itself, if it's just pure pearlite, as I mentioned, is high carbon and strong.
In contrast, the very thin layer of clay on the blade means that it cools very rapidly, so more of the carbon is trapped in the lattice. This forces the lattice structure to change from cubic to tetragonal, making a form of steel known as martensite. Since the trapped carbon puts stress on the lattice, martensite is incredibly hard, exactly what you'd want for the edge of a sword.
Yeah, and this is correct. Should also mention that it's not necessarily just because of the speed of cooling on the edge, it's the amount of carbon in that steel as well. If you cooled down the back at the same speed, if it had a thin layer, it wouldn't form martensite. There's just not enough carbon in it to achieve that. It's low carbon stuff on the edge spine, low carbon on the core and on the back. On the edge, absolutely. And martensite is awesome. What's really awesome about martensite is then if you temper it enough at the right rate, okay, usually heating it up to where it glows yellow, it then becomes a spring, and you get spring steel. You can't do that with a katana because it's only martensite on that edge.
The sword is then placed back in the forge to evaporate any remaining water. This also provides a little bit of energy to loosen some of the crystal structures, making the sword less brittle.
Yeah, this is... Because remember, it adopted the hardness because of the quenching, but then if you heat it up and then let it cool it down at a different rate, you can get rid of that hardness completely. And heating it up a little bit, tempering, can actually release enough of the stress to turn it a spring. You don't achieve that with a katana because it's got a not only different harden, but a different grade of steel in the sword itself. And it doesn't seem they want to temper it too much because they one of the benefits of the katana is that super hard edge. Tempering can make it soft where it's more equivalent to many high-grade European swords. I would actually kind of prefer that because it means less chipping and the edge ends up being a bit more durable.
On a Japanese sword, which that might be enough to relax things a bit, but they kept the edge much harder than you would have in the West.
And that's true, exactly what I mentioned. They did keep the edge much harder, and I wonder if it's because they were striking just softer targets more often, and especially avoiding blade-on-blade contact. But if they're only going to be deflecting with the back of the blade of the katana, there are ways that you could avoid edge damage a bit longer.
To learn how to use a Japanese sword, Peter got a lesson from a master, Takara Takanashi. He is the 10th generation student of Miyamoto Musashi.
So during the lesson, I thought I would get to use a katana, but instead we spent the entire time learning how to take the blade out of its sheath and then put it back in.
I got to comment on this because this is one of my pet peeves. It's the over-ceremonialization of martial arts and sword use. And for tradition's sake, I see value in it. For martial kind of practice and interest in swords, just bothers the heck out of me because that guaranteed was not so stringent or strict or enforced during the main warfare period of samurai using katana on the battlefield, okay? It's laughable to think that all samurai was so stringent and restricted, like, you better learn how to sheath and unsheath the sword properly. Most samurai actually were just pragmatists. The sword was a tool, and if it got bent, they just bent it back, and they didn't put it on, revere it to the level that it started to achieve after the samurai started to be less represented on the battlefield, and they were using, guns more often and stuff, and then tradition and ceremonialization kind of came in. But the samurai were practical soldiers and warriors back in the day. They would have drawn the sword however way they felt was useful, effective, and that's it. And then to restrict people's interests in wanting to explore the use of swords they have to know how to draw and sheath it, when that is also starting to misrepresent the past. It's just like, that because the implications, and this is how the samurai did it. No, that there was just practicality, and things were not nearly as centralized and dogmatic as what modern martial arts might imply.
Slice through some things. Amazing day. We just
It seems to be implying that the ease in which he's chopped through a tatami is the result of the quality of the katana, and the katana can be easy to cut with for inexperienced people, but almost for none of the reasons they mentioned in this video. Okay, it's more about edge geometry, edge geometry, structure, construction of the handle as well, and just if you have a really sharp bit of steel, it's easy to chop through a tatami with really anything if it's sharp enough. Okay, and so. This isn't anything special, but they seem to be presenting it as such. But it is fun. And look, I've had that reaction when a sword just performs better in a cut because of, again, geometry, weight, easy to swing, sharpness, stuff like that, where it just zips through, and I have that result like, wow, that is awesome. Had that with many swords, not just the katana, of course, but some katanas are just gorgeous and, yeah, they're good cutters.
There really is something remarkable about Japanese swords.
Yes, right? But, like, to me, there is things as equally remarkable about many other swords, like the whole Damascus steel swords. I have a video on that, and funny, that was responding to SciShow, that one, right? Very misunderstood. Fascinating subject. European swords, Chinese swords. Of course, my focus and bias is medieval Europe. It's my main area of love and history. But I find Japanese swords incredibly intriguing. Why do you think I've done so much research? Why do you think I own so many? But the idea that they are uniquely special is a pet peeve. It's like, no, they're really cool as well as so many other swords. And then you get to, like, you know, medieval spring steel swords that still have the temper that are in museums, just like are amazing.
The amount of care, attention, and expertise that each step requires.
Is this implying that the care, expertise, and attention was only focused so heavily in Japan? And by the way, again, Japan, modern-day Japan, has a kind of like a practice of ritualizing many things when a lot of blacksmiths in the past, they're not going to be praying every time they start smelting the steel, and they're not restricting it to only doing it at a certain time of the year or things like that. Practical workers, okay? Got a job to get done, we get it done. They'll put time and effort into it, but there are ones that put more effort and less. Same within Europe. There are, like, some of the craftsmanship in Europe, just medieval Europe, are insane. The quality and just craftsmanship, some of these pieces, surviving pieces, made me drop dead almost with how incredible they are. And there's an equivalent level of care and attention that you can see in these works of art. But to imply that it is uniquely better or superior or special in Japan with sword manufacture versus other areas of the world is nonsense. It's not the case.
From the gathering and refining of the iron sand, to the smelting, to the forging.
Is that an acknowledgement that they refined the iron sand to get rid of more impurities in a modern method that they didn't do historically? I don't know.
And sharpening a sword, each step takes so much time and skill. It's incredible that all these things were discovered by trial and error to produce artifacts of such high quality that they are still prized centuries later.
And I think sometimes overpriced because of the misinformation and inflation and culture that's kind of evolved around it. And there's a bit of propaganda inflating the katana more than it really should. And as a result, they're more expensive than probably they should be as well. But look, I do appreciate and love that there are many craftsmen in Japan keeping a tradition alive. I think that's brilliant. But then to imply certain things at being superior and the misinformation around it, that's annoying.
Before I made this video, I didn't really appreciate that swords can be art.
And I hope he extends that to many swords that are art as well, because the katana, I do believe, is a work of art. It is gorgeous. That's actually where I think more of the value and appreciation can come from, not the fact that people assume it's a superior, more functional sword. There are problems with the katana. There are problems with other swords as well, all right? And so, people then think that it's so great because it must be so good. No. Like, it's just a good sword, but it's not the best sword in the world. But the artistry, yeah, I appreciate that, absolutely, as with many other swords.
To me, it's a good reminder that whatever you do, you should do it with deep care, attention to detail, and love for the craft. Do that enough times, and you might just make something beautiful.
And there we go. That is my response to the Veritasium video, how the most expensive swords in the world are made. And there were some good parts, but I was skipping over those, focusing on the ones that I wanted to add a bit more context to, you could say. And unfortunately, there is a decent amount of incorrect information and misinformation in it. But it's one of those things where this is one of those topics that you can get lost in. I've been lost my whole life, where I go deeper and deeper because I want to know how these swords are actually made. I love using them, putting the test, seeing how strong they are. And as a result, this is one of those areas where I have a bit more understanding that I love to share, and also correct some of the misinformation that's out there, because the katana, well, I think we've seen there's a lot of misinformation, even in, people with good intentions and stuff. But hey, love Veritasium, love what he does. Do enjoy their videos, subscribe to him and all that stuff. Hope you subscribe here on Shadiversity as you see us put these swords to the test. Hope to see you there. And until that time, farewell.